Good morning and welcome to Jew in the City Speaks with your host, Allison Josephs, also known as Jew in the City. We like to track topics that are happening in the news and talk about how they relate to our organization, our mission. Anti-Semitism is trending right now as a topic, and anti-Zionism is trending as a topic, and actually the two are quite related. I had a realization, I think, in the last year that sort of larger society is okay with Jews as long as we're not too Jewish. If we are not too into our heritage, like not too weirdly religious, and if we're not too into our land, like we shouldn't be Zionistic, if we mostly come off as like secular Jews, maybe say oy vey, occasionally eat a bagel, maybe we are passable Jews. The truth is that there are similarities for other minorities. There's a similarity for how the Black community was treated, that, sort of whiter Black people were given, preferential treatment in the age of slavery. There's a term we don't use anymore to describe sort of the Black person that, is obsequious to the white person and tries to fit in. And it got me thinking that this is not acceptable, that minorities, including Jews, should be able to be fully who we are, fully lean into what makes us unique. And in an age of continuing to celebrate minorities, and we've seen so many of these bad patterns, thankfully, ending for other groups. For the Jewish community, these patterns have not ended. We are still being made fun of, mocked so openly in media for being too religious, for being so backwards, so, not with the times, if we're quote unquote too Orthodox. And we're raked over the coals if we believe that we should have a homeland, and that we have, a 1,000-year-old connection to the land of Israel. And I got to speaking recently with a historian. His name is Dr. Josh Karlip, about have we seen patterns like this before in Jewish history? And I asked him to come onto the show to discuss when and where we've seen similar patterns where non-Jewish regimes have kind of asked us to disavow our heritage, our connection to our land in an effort to fit better in. And I think, if we want to understand where we are today, where we're going, it's always important to understand our history. So Dr. Karlip, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you so much for having me.
And I want to give our listeners just a quick intro onto your background. So you are the Herbert S. and Naomi Denenberg Associate Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University. You've taught at Yeshiva College, Stern College, Bernard Revel Graduate School. You have served as Associate Director of YU Center for Israel Studies, written numerous publications, A Tragedy of a Generation, and your current book project is Rabbis in the Lands of Atheism, the Struggle to Save Judaism in the Soviet Union. So yeah, thank you for joining us on the show today.
It's my pleasure. It's an honor to be here with you.
Thank you. So I guess probably the most famous, point in history, because we eat these fun little cookies to go along with it, of a non-Jewish regime putting on the Jewish community to be just a little less Jewish, to be acceptable, are the Greek Hellenists. Am I right? Is that sort of the first time in Jewish history that we have this sort of deal that's offered to us by non-Jews?
A historian is always a little bit afraid to say the first time, right? Because
okay, fine.
One time before that I'm not thinking of, but it's certainly the most major time in antiquity, and something that served as a real a model for the future. And not only were we made that offer, you can be totally accepted if you accept our culture and our pantheon of gods, and give up your religious particularity, but it also is a foreshadowing of the type of culture wars that we have today, to this day, between Jews who feel that the price is not worth paying, and those who do feel it's worth paying, and those who believe that it's worth paying, painting the others as fanatics, as narrow-minded, as clannish, all of those things.
Actually, that's another interesting point. I'm curious, did we see those patterns within the Jewish community in historic times where the ones that dug their heels in and said, we won't give up who we are? Does there become this battle between the Jewish community of the people that are accepting the non-Jewish culture in an effort to save themselves, to survive? Do they feel annoyed by their religious brethren who are insisting on being so Jewish still?
Yeah, I want to briefly, I'm a modernist, so I'm not going to say too much about the medieval period, but I will say one thing, and that is in the medieval period, there really was, in most places, there always were exceptions. There really, in Christian Europe, if you're Jewish, you have many legal disabilities. The really only one major ticket out was conversion. Throughout history, in every generation, there were Jews who converted to Christianity. And they were joining the many against the few. And I think that it's not accidental that it was amongst those converts that we had some of the biggest prosecutors against the Jewish religion. In 1240, there was the disputation between Nicholas Donin and Rabbeinu Asher, who was known as the Rush. Nicholas Donin was a former Jew who had converted to and become a priest. It happened again with Pablo Cristiani a generation later with Ramban. It happened in 1414 in Tortosa with Yehoshua Halorki, who became Geronimo de Santa Fe. And it happened throughout history. In the modern period, the Jews were first given a choice to remain Jewish and enter mainstream society, but with a big price. And that came at the time of the French Revolution, when the Jews were offered emancipation, were offered to become citizens like everyone else. But from the beginning, even the advocates of emancipation, one of them, the biggest one, was named Clermont-Tonnet. And he made a famous speech in the French National Assembly in 1789, soon after the revolution. And he said, quote, "To the Jews as individuals, everything. To the Jews as a nation, nothing." In other words, if Jews are going to become citizens of France, they're going to have to give up everything that is nationally particular about them. They're overtly strange customs, living in a community that runs itself according to halakha, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was the admission ticket into European society.
So this whole idea of liberté, fraternité, égalité, maybe I said it wrong, freedom, equality, brotherhood, not if you feel the need to remain a Jew. You have to disavow yourself. So what happened at that point? So the Enlightenment, then we have this split now between the Jewish community. What percentage of the community takes Napoleon's offer? What percentage digs in their heels and says, we're not going to work on Saturday?
Right. So the community was granted emancipation. And by the way, the Jews were one of the only groups that had to swear an oath of loyalty when they became emancipated, when they became citizens. And you don't have the analogous situation with most Christian groups. But in 1806,
actually, can I interrupt you quickly? What did they gain with their emancipation? What were they lacking before, and what changed through emancipation?
First of all, most Jews at the time, the majority of Ashkenazi Jews, the overwhelming majority, lived in the border area between France and Germany, Alsace-Lorraine.
Okay.
So with emancipation, they can go and live anywhere they want. They also now are citizens like everybody else. Now, it is fair to say that before the French Revolution, there's no such thing as a citizen in a modern sense because everybody's a subject of the emperor. However, they're creating a citizenship and they're telling the Jews, you're either going to be citizens like everyone else and enjoy all the rights of a French citizen, or you're going to be something other. And in order to be a citizen, though, you have to make this trade-off. And so I think most Jews did it without necessarily, the average Jew, let's say, without necessarily understanding just what they were ready to give up. And then over time there becomes a momentum. When a Jew moves to Paris, so if they move to Paris, they're not going to speak Yiddish anymore, and the Jews of Alsace-Lorraine spoke a Western form of Yiddish. They're going to speak French, and slowly, over the course of the first half of the 19th century, the majority of French Jews shed their what we now call religious orthodoxy, right, and give up those halachot that are seen as the most bizarre. Kashrut for many, Shabbos. And the majority of French Jews over the course of the first half of the 19th century become, while there's not an ideological reform movement there, well, that Germany's the center for that, they become much less observant.
What happens in terms of their numbers of retention? How do we have a sense of how the population goes as they begin to sort of peel away their observances and traditions?
We have to remember that the Jews of Europe, for the most part, through the 19th century, didn't have the choice of radical assimilation that we have today, of intermarriage and just disappearing away. In order to intermarry, they still had to convert. So there certainly was that process, but it was more of a slower acculturation, and you had more of a retention rate than you have, let's say, in America today. However, in Germany, at the beginning of the 19th century, you really did have a wave of conversions, a wave of conversions out of convenience, because people didn't want to live in two worlds. I just wanted to say that in 1806, Napoleon gets messages from non-Jews in Alsace-Lorraine complaining that Jews are not living up to their side of the bargain. They're still too parochial, they're still lending money at interest, they're still living in their own communities. So he creates something called an Assembly of Jewish Notables, and he poses questions to them. And based on the answers to the question is whether or not they get to keep their emancipation. And the questions are things like, is divorce allowed under Jewish law? And the reason they're asking that question is because divorce was not allowed under French civil law, because French civil law was based on Catholic law. Can Jews have more than one wife? Here's the most sensitive. Can a Jew marry a Christian? And so do Jews consider Frenchmen their brethren, or do they consider them aliens? And the assembly, with some rabbis and some lay people, recognize that based on how they answer, will be whether or not they get to keep their emancipation. So they answer definitely in a very smart way, not always 100% truthfully. So for instance, about when it comes to intermarriage, they say technically the Torah never says anywhere in the Torah a Jew can't marry a Christian, because the 5 books of Moses don't mention Christians, because it's it's thousands of years before the rise of Christianity. And technically the Torah only talks about 7 nations, right? But there's this little technicality called Kedushin, and Kedushin only takes effect with 2 Jews. So therefore, the rabbis will not perform a ceremony of marriage between a Jew and a Christian. That's how they get out of it. But you see this notion of dual loyalty that we so much hear today against Jews who are pro-Israel. How can you be a Zionist? How can you be pro-Israel and also a loyal American? Goes right back to 1806. Can you be a loyal Frenchman and also a member of the Jewish nation? The answer that Napoleon was giving, and really that the Assembly of Jewish Notables was willing to say, at least on record, was no, and that we're Jews only by religion and not by nationality. But even the religion can't be too national looking. So the reform movement in Germany, the first major reform temple in Hamburg in 1819, one of the first changes they made to the liturgy, to the Siddur, was they took out all references to Zion and Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. They took out references to the chosenness of the Jewish people, anything that was too particular, because Jews had to prove that they're loyal Germans. In Germany,
who asked them to do that in Germany? We have the leadership in France you mentioned. Who in Germany was putting that pressure on the Jews?
In France, emancipation happened all at once. In
Okay.
Germany, it was a slow, protracted process that lasted for decades and decades, because Germany, you have to remember, until 1871, there was no one German state. There were lots of little German states. And so they were all going at their own pace. But all of them had this quid pro quo. Rights was called rights in exchange for regeneration, right? You Jew, everybody, the Jew haters and the Jew defenders did not differ on the fact that the Jews needed serious, as we would say in Ivrit, drushim shipur. The Jews need serious work. They need serious repair. What they disagreed on was the cause. The anti-Semites said that they're just innately like that. You're never going to change them. And the defenders said it's because of persecution, but if you give them rights and they change, they'll come around. And so that whole ideology was what was driving it in Germany.
So even the Jew defenders, still the idea was to de-Jewify us, to make us less Jewish. It was just a little like a benefit of the doubt that we were so weird because we've been persecuted, but if you just be nice to the Jews, they won't be so weird. Am I getting right?
Yes, but the Jews have to live up to their end of the bargain. You see, what this did to those who bought into this on the Jewish side was that, of course, if there's still anti-Semitism and we're still not accepted, right, or we still don't have emancipation yet, it's always our fault. It must be that we haven't lived up to our end of the bargain. And increasingly, as there's a backlash of anti-Semitism in Germany in the later part of the 19th century, that's what also the Christian side is saying. You didn't live up to your side of the bargain. In other words, and even as it turns out, as we look back on this, the most that the Jews would offer was not enough for many on the German side. So in other words, German Jews believed if we reform our religion and we say we're Germans by nationality and we're Jews by religion, and we don't keep these weird ceremonial laws, but we just are focused on Jewish ethics and monotheism, but we still have our own temples and we still have our own community, that's enough. And many Christians were saying, no, it's not. We expected you to completely disappear.
And what about, I know these are the main centers, what about a place like England? Are there any other countries that there's something similar happening? Or there's sort of the Enlightenment is happening in Western Europe altogether. So is there anything else notable happening kind of in that area of the world at the same time for Jews?
I'm sure there is. I'm not an expert. I'll be honest. I'm not an expert on England. So I'm going to not say too much about these other places, but I do want to speak about the country that I am an expert on, and that's Russia. And in Russia, in the 19th century, and Russia is an autocracy, right? So it's a very different type of regime. Nicholas I, Tsar Nicholas I, concludes that these Jews are a possible fifth column who live in the Pale of Settlement, which are, today, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, parts of what today are Poland. And they're never going to be good Russian subjects as long as they're so different, as long as they dress differently and speak differently and have these bizarre customs. And so he set up about to try to acculturate them more. One way was through the draft, through a draconian draft, which was a certain number, about 4 to 8 per thousand youth who would be drafted for 25 years, and if they're under 18 for 31 years. And what's interesting, and many other things, what's interesting is that the Maskilim, the Jewish enlighteners, they jumped along with this ideology. And they basically said, we have to change ourselves. We have to prove ourselves. So a group of Maskilim petitioned the Tsar in the 1840s and wrote in the letter to the Tsar, the Jews of Russia are never going to integrate as long as they wear these strange clothes. Ban traditional Jewish clothing. Now, if you would go in a time machine and land in Vilna in 1840, the closest thing that I would say in terms of the dress would be, it would look like Hasidim today. Long black coats for the men and fur hats, streimels, women wearing turbans, and actually many even shaving their heads. And this was a uniform Jewish custom throughout Eastern Europe. We consider it Hasidish today because the Hasidim dug in their heels and said, we're not giving this up. But the Maskilim petitioned the government, and by the way, and then wrote at the end of the letter, please don't give our names to the Jewish community. So, got to hide themselves that way. And the Tsar's government went ahead and banned traditional Jewish clothing. That's one example. And I don't want to generalize and say that the Haskalah was all about this. There were more positive elements. There was a revival of the Hebrew language, and even what some historians might call a proto-nationalism of sorts. But this was a pretty big, element of it also.
Practically speaking, did Jews stop wearing the black frocks and streimels for a certain period of time because it was illegal?
So different Jews took different tacks. Some did, and other places, like for instance in Warsaw, the first Gera Rebbe lived in Warsaw at the time, even before he went to the little town of Ger, and he helped figure out a loophole, and that was that the Jews, okay, so you have to register what kind of clothing you want to wear. Do you want to wear German clothing, which was sort of like, short jackets, what we think of Western clothing, or Russian clothing? And guess how Russian men dressed? They had long beards, they wore long coats. So what a lot of people in Warsaw did is they just sort of they kept the long coat, but they changed the buttons around a little bit and declared themselves as wearing Russian clothes. So sometimes that's how a lot of Hasidic groups got around it. But the Litvisha in general didn't have that option. The laws were stricter there because it was closer actually to real Russian territory. And that's why in the Litvisha world today, they don't wear that classic East European Jewish garb most of the time, that today we call basically Hasidic garb, because those are the ones who maintained it.
So anyone that has family from Eastern Europe that's Ashkenazi, even if you don't have Hasidic roots specifically, your great-great-great-grandparents probably dress like today's modern Hasidic Jews, pretty similar to that?
It's the most similar. Yeah, it's the most similar. And the men had, you read descriptions, they had what we would call the Kreisel to payas, the long twisted payas. Yeah. I mean, look, it's not exactly the same, but if the person would come back today and have Tchias HaMesim and a resurrection and land in New York, they would say the people in Williamsburg look the most like they did. Yeah.
Okay, so that is Russian history in terms of the Tsar, and then obviously with the USSR, there was another, sort of trying to de-Jewify the Jew. Is that something else that is an area that you study, or? Very
much so. That is, that was the Tsar, what was going on with the Tsar on steroids. In other words, I often tell my students, the Tsars were generally nasty, but they were very inefficient. So they generally didn't accomplish that much towards their goal of de-Judaizing the Jews. But the communists, the Bolsheviks, were extremely efficient. And so, they accomplished in a few years what the Tsars hadn't over decades. Basically, the Soviets made basically offered the Jews the same type of deal. You can be Soviet citizens, and you can even rise as individuals to the top, as long as, but Orthodoxy, was forbidden. Jewish religion was virtually forbidden, and Zionism was considered an absolute anathema, absolutely treif. And so you can be a Jew. Historians have often put it, there was a historian, Ezra Mendelsohn at Hebrew University, who put it this way: the Soviet Union was good for Jews, but bad for Judaism. In other words, an individual Jew is willing to give up virtually every aspect of the Jewish identity, except a narrow Soviet Yiddish culture. And even that was de-Judaized, because even the language, Hebrew, all the Hebrew words were basically spelled completely differently in Yiddish to take away, to remove it from its religious and national roots. And if you go along with that, you can rise as high as you want. But if not, if you're an Orthodox Jew, if you're a Zionist, if you're anything, you face, persecution at best, and jail time, and worse, and execution at worst. Now, I have to say that was before World War II. After World War II, it's not good to be a Jew either in the Soviet Union, which leads me to my next conclusion, that what we see happening now in America, is very similar in the sense that there are many Jews who are willing to go along with this deal to protect themselves. And they're happy to throw the Jewish-looking Jew to the wolves. What they're doing in the long run is they're weakening, when they weaken the whole Jewish community that way, they themselves ultimately become the target. So it may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but those Jewish communists who are called the Yevsektia, the Jewish sections of the Communist Party, who zealously shut down shuls and shut down chadarim, Jewish one-room schoolhouses, they were empowered by the state to do that, and they did it with a vengeance, and they got benefits, in the 20s and into the 30s. But by the mid 30s, there were purges, and those who weren't killed in 36, 37 were killed in 1951. All the Yiddish writers and the Yiddish elite was murdered by Stalin. And so, they had basically, first they went after all the Jews who were deemed unkosher, right, according to Soviet ideology. And then once they did that dirty work, then the regime turned on them.
All right, so the message basically is we have to stay united as a people, and not erase ourselves, not give in. And I mean, obviously, we're living in a time where, thankfully, it is legal to be Jewish. It is legal to, look Jewish, practice Judaism, be a Zionist. But I think the thing that people are feeling scared about now is it's feeling less and less popular. It's feeling less and less comfortable. There's more and more disdain if you do these things openly. And, with this history, with these, numerous similar patterns throughout the generations, I think we just have to keep our eyes open as to what's developing. Would you agree? Is that
100% agree. I just want to say one last thing, and that is that the situation today, you're right, it's not forced like it was in the Soviet Union, but there's tremendous pressure. So you have a professor, I'm blessed to teach at Yeshiva University, the flagship Jewish university outside of Israel, and proudly a Zionist institution. But I have many, many colleagues who teach at secular universities. And last year during the war in Gaza, there was tremendous pressure put on them to sign anti-Israel statements. And I saw many colleagues' names on these statements. And I can only surmise that some of them actually believe this anti-Israel rhetoric, but many of them felt compelled to sign. And, it's the same dynamic.
Try to save yourself? Wow, fascinating. And I think we have to keep reminding ourselves of where we came from so we can, be aware and, share this information with others, because I think the thing about being Jewish, you don't want to let history repeat itself when it's negative history. So thank you so much for elucidating this pattern for our listeners today. And we wish you continued hatzlacha.
It's my pleasure, Allison. Thank you for everything you do.
Thank you. And you can catch us same time, same place next week. Bye-bye.